murdered souls always go to heaven. So we'll both be serving God this afternoon, Gary. Isn't that nice? He reached for me again with his long, pale hands. Without thinking what I was doing, I flipped open the top of my creel, hauled all the way down to the bottom, and brought out the monster brookie I'd caught earlier, the one that I should have been satisfied with. I held it out to him blindly, my fingers in the red slit of its belly from which I had removed its insides, as the man in the black suit had threatened to remove mine. The fish's glazed eyes stared dreamily at me, the gold ring in the black center reminding me of my mother's wedding ring. And in that moment, I saw her lying in her coffin with the sun shining off of the wedding band, and I knew it was true. That she'd been stung by a bee, that she had drowned in the warm bread-smelling kitchen air, and Candy Bill had licked her drying tears from her swollen cheeks. "Big fish," said the man in the black suit with a guttural, greedy voice. "Oh, big fish." He snatched it away from me and crammed it into a mouth that opened wider than any human mouth ever could. Many years later, when I was 65, I know it was 65 because that was the summer I retired from teaching, I went to the New England Aquarium and finally saw a shark. The mouth of the man in the black suit was like that shark's mouth when it opened, only his gullet was blazing red, the same color as his awful eyes, and I felt heat bake out of it and into my face the way you feel a sudden wave of heat come pushing out from a fireplace when a dry piece of wood catches alight. And I didn't imagine the heat, either. I know I didn't, because just before he slid the head of my 19-inch brook trout between his gaping jaws, I saw the scales along the sides of the fish rise up and begin to curl like bits of paper floating over an open incinerator. He slid the fish in like a man in a traveling show swallowing a sword. He didn't chew, and his blazing eyes bulged out as if in effort. The fish went in and went in. His throat bulged as it slid down his gullet, and now he began to cry tears of his own, except his tears were blood, scarlet and thick. I think it was the sight of those bloody tears that gave me my body back. I don't know why that should have been, but I think it was. I bolted to my feet like a jack released from its box, turned with my bamboo pole still in one hand, and fled up the bank, bending over and tearing rough bunches of weeds out with my free hand in an effort to get up the slope more quickly. He made a strangled, furious noise, the sound of a man with his mouth too full, and I looked back just as I got to the top. He was coming after me, the back of his suit coat flapping and his thin gold watch chain flashing and winking in the sun. The tail of the fish was still protruding from his mouth, and I could smell the rest of it roasting in the oven of his throat. He reached for me, groping with his talons, and I fled along the top of the bank. After 100 yards or so, I found my voice and went to screaming. Screaming in fear, of course, but also screaming in grief for my beautiful dead mother. He was coming after me. I could hear snapping branches and whipping bushes, but I didn't look back again. I lowered my head, slid in my eyes against the bushes and low-hanging branches along the stream's bank, and ran as fast as I could. At every step, I expected to feel his hands descending on my shoulders, pulling me back into a final hot hug. But that didn't happen. Some unknown length of time later, it couldn't have been longer than 5 or 10 minutes, I suppose, but it seemed like forever. I saw the bridge through the layers of leaves and furs, still screaming but breathless now, sounding like a tea kettle which is almost boiled dry. I reached the second steeper bank and charged up onto it. Halfway to the top, I slipped to my knees, looked over my shoulder, and saw the man in the black suit almost at my heel, his white face pulled into a convulsion of fury and greed. His cheeks were splattered with his bloody tears, and his shark's mouth hung open like a hinge. "Fisher boy!" he snarled, and started up the bank after me, grasping at my foot with one long hand. I tore free, turned, and threw my fishing pole at him. He batted it down easily, but it tangled in his feet somehow, and he went to his knees. I didn't wait to see any more. I turned and bolted to the top of the slope. I almost slipped at the very top, but managed to grab one of the support struts running beneath the bridge and save myself. "You can't get away, Fisher boy!" he cried from behind me. He sounded furious, but also sounded as if he were laughing. "It takes more than a mouthful of trout to fill me up." "Leave me alone!" I screamed back at him. I grabbed the bridge's railing and threw myself over it in a clumsy somersault, filling my hands with splinters and bumping my head so hard on the boards that when I came down, I saw stars. I rolled over onto my belly and began crawling. I lurched to my feet just before I got to the end of the bridge, stumbling once, found my rhythm, and then began to run. I ran as only 9-year-old boys can run, which is like the wind. It felt as if my feet only touched the ground with every third or fourth stride, and for all I knew, that might be true. I ran straight up to the right-hand wheel rut in the road and ran until my temples pounded and my eyes pulsed in their sockets. I ran until I had a hot stitch in my left side from the bottom of my ribs to my armpit. Ran until I could taste blood and something like metal shavings in the back of my throat. When I couldn't run anymore, I stumbled to a stop and looked back over my shoulder, puffing and blowing like a wind-broke horse. I was convinced that I would see him standing right there behind me with his nasty black suit and the watch chain a glittering loop across his vest and not a hair out of place. But he was gone. The road stretched back towards Castle Stream between the darkly massed pines and spruce was empty. And yet, I sensed him somewhere near in those woods, watching me with his grass-fire eyes, smelling of burnt matches and roasted fish. I turned and began walking as fast as I could, limping a little. I pulled muscles in both legs, and when I got out of bed the next day, I was so sore I could barely walk. I didn't notice those things then, though. I just kept looking over my shoulder, needing again and again to verify that the road behind me was still empty. It was, each time I looked. But those backward glances seemed to increase my fear rather than lessen it. The firs looked darker and massier, and I kept imagining what lay beyond the trees which marched beside the road. Long, tangled corridors of forest, leg-breaking deadfalls, ravines where anything might live. Until that Saturday in 1914, I had thought that bears were the worst thing in the forest could hold. Now I knew better. A mile or so further up the road, just beyond the place where it came out of the woods and joined the Geoghegan Flat Road, I saw my father walking towards me, whistling The Old Oaken Bucket. He was carrying his own rod, the one with the fancy spinning reel from Monkey Ward, and in his other hand he had his creel, the one with the ribbon my mother had woven through the handle back when Dan was alive. Dedicated to Jesus, the ribbon said. I had been walking, but when I saw him I started to run again, screaming, "Dad! Dad! Dad!" at the top of my lungs, staggering from side to side on my tired, sprung legs like a drunken sailor. The expression of surprise on his face when he recognized me might have been comical under other circumstances, but not under these. He dropped his rod and creel into the road without so much as a downward glance at them and ran to me. It was the fastest I ever saw my dad run in his life. When we came together, it was a wonder that the impact didn't knock us both senseless, and I struck my face on his belt buckle hard enough to start a little nosebleed. I didn't notice until later, though. Right then, I only reached out my arms and clutched him as hard as I could. I held on and rubbed my hot face back and forth against his belly, covering his old blue work shirt with blood and tears and snot. "Gary, what is it? What happened? Are you all right?" "Ma's dead," I sobbed. "I met a man in the woods, and he told me Ma's dead. She got stung by a bee, and it swelled her all up like what happened to Dan, and she's dead. She's on the kitchen floor, and Candy Bill licked the tears off her face," was the last word I had to say, but by then my chest was hitching so bad I couldn't get it out. My tears were flowing again, and my dad's startled, frightened face had blurred into 3 overlapping images. I began to howl, not like a little kid who's skunned his knee, but like a dog that's seen something bad by moonlight. And my father pressed my head against his hard, flat stomach again. I slipped out from under his hand, though, and looked back over my shoulder. I wanted to make sure the man in the black suit wasn't coming. There was no sign of him. The road, winding back into the woods, was completely empty. I promised myself I would never go back down that road again, not ever, no matter what. And I suppose now God's greatest blessing to his creatures below is that they can't see the future. Because it might have broken my mind if I had known that I would be going back down that road, and not 2 hours later. For the moment, though, I was only relieved to see that we were still alone. And then I thought of my mother, my beautiful, dead mother, and I laid my face back against my father's stomach and bawled some more. "Gary, listen to me," he said a moment or two later, and I went on bawling. He gave me a little longer to do that, and then reached down and lifted my chin so he could look in my face and I could look into his. "Your mom is fine." I could only look at him with tears streaming down my cheeks. I didn't believe him. I don't know who told you different, or what kind of dirty dog would want to put a scare like that into a little boy, but I swear to God, your mother is fine. But he said, I don't care what he said. I got back from Eversham's earlier than I expected. He doesn't want to sell any cows, it's all talk. And I decided I had time to catch up with you. I got my pole and my creel, and your mother made us a couple of jelly foldovers. Her new bread. It's still warm. So she was fine half an hour ago, Gary, and there's no one knows any different come from this direction, I guarantee you. Not in just half an hour's time. He looked over my shoulder. Who was this man? And where is he? I'm going to find him and thrash him within an inch of his life. I thought 1,000 things in those 2 seconds. Well, that's what it seemed like anyway. But the last thing I thought was the most powerful. If my dad met up with the man in the black suit, I didn't think my dad would be the one to do the thrashing or the walking away. I kept remembering the long white fingers and the talons at the end of them. Gary, I don't know, I said. Were you where the stream splits, the big rock? I could never lie to my father when he asked me a direct question, not to save his life or mine. Yes, but don't go down there. I seized his arm with both hands and tugged at her. Please don't. He was a scary man. Inspiration struck me like an illuminating lightning bolt. I think he had a gun. He looked thoughtfully at me. Well, maybe there wasn't a man, he said, lifting his voice a little at the last word and turning it into something that was almost but not quite a question. Maybe you fell asleep while you were fishing, son, and had a bad dream, like the ones you had about Danny last winter. I had a lot of bad dreams about Dan last winter. Dreams where I would open the door to our closet or the dark, fruity interior of the cedar shed and see him standing there looking at me out of his purple, strangulated face. From many of these dreams I had awakened screaming, awakened my parents as well. I'd fallen asleep on the bank of the stream for a little while, too. Dozed off anyway. But I hadn't dreamed, and I was sure I had wakened just before the man in the black suit clapped the bead head, sending it tumbling off my nose and into my lap. I hadn't dreamed him the way I had dreamed Dan. I was quite sure of that, although my meeting with him had certainly attained a dreamlike quality in my mind, as I suppose supernatural occurrences always must. But if my dad thought that the man only existed in my own head, that might be better. Better for him. Well, it might have been, I guess, I said. Well, we ought to go back and get your rod and your creel. He actually started in that direction, and I had to tug frantically at his arm to stop him and to turn him back towards me. Later, I said. Please, Dad. I want to see Mother. I've got to see her with my own eyes. He thought that over and then nodded. Yes, I suppose you do. We'll go home first and get your rod and creel later. So we walked back to the farm together, my father with his fishing pole propped on his shoulder, just like one of my friends, me carrying his creel, both of us eating fold-over slices of my mom's bread smeared with blackcurrant jam. Did you catch anything? He asked as we came inside of the barn. Yes, sir. A rainbow, pretty good size. And a brookie that was a lot bigger, I thought, but didn't say. Biggest one I ever saw, to tell the truth. But I don't have that one to show you, Dad. I gave that one to the man in the black suit, so he wouldn't eat me. And it worked. But just barely. That's all? Nothing else? After I caught it, I fell asleep. This was not really an answer, but not really a lie, either. Lucky you didn't lose your pole. You didn't, did you, Gary? No, sir, I said very reluctantly. Lying about that would do no good if I'd been able to think up a whopper. Not if he was set on going back to get my creel anyway, and I could see by his face that I was. Up ahead, Candy Bill came racing out the back door, barking his shrill bark and wagging his whole rear end back and forth the way the Scotties do when they're excited. I couldn't wait any longer. Hope and anxiety bubbled up in my throat like foam. I broke away from my father and ran into the house, still lugging his creel and still convinced in my heart of hearts that I was going to find my mother dead on the kitchen floor with her face swelled and purple like Dan's had been when my father had carried him from the Westfield, crying and calling the name of Jesus. But she was standing at the counter, just as well and fine as when I'd left her, humming a song She shelled peas into a bowl. She looked around at me, first in surprise, and then in fright as she took in my wide eyes and pale cheeks. "Gary, what is it? What's the matter?" I didn't answer, only ran to her and covered her with kisses. At some point, my father came in and said, "Don't worry, Lo, he's all right. He just had one of his bad dreams down by the brook." "Pray God that's the last of them," she said, and hugged me tighter while Candy Bill danced around our feet, barking his shrill bark. "You don't have to come with me if you don't want to, Gary," my father said, although he had already made it clear that he thought that I should. That I should go back, that I should face my fear, as I suppose folks would say nowadays, but that's very well for fearful things that are make-believe, but 2 hours hadn't gone since to change my conviction that the man in the black suit had been very real. I wouldn't be able to convince my father of that. I wouldn't be able to convince my father of that, though. I don't think there was a 9-year-old that ever lived who would be able to convince his father that he'd seen the devil come walking out of the woods in a black suit. "I'll come," I said. I walked to the house to join him before he left, mustering all the courage in order to get my feet moving, and now we were standing by the chopping block on the side yard, not far from the woodpile. "What's that you've got behind your back?" he asked. I brought it out slowly. I would go with him. I would hope that the man in the black suit with the arrow-straight part down the left side of his head was gone. But if he wasn't, I wanted to be prepared. Well, as prepared as I could be, anyway. I had the family Bible in my hand, I had the family Bible in the hand that I brought out from behind my back. I'd set out just to bring my New Testament, which I had won for memorizing the most Psalms on Thursday night youth fellowship competition. I managed 8, although most of them, except the 23rd, had floated out of my mind in a week's time. But the little red testament didn't seem like enough when you were going to face the devil himself, not even when the words of Jesus were marked out in red ink. My father looked at the old Bible, swelling with family documents and pictures, and I thought he'd tell me to put it back, but he didn't. There was a mixed grief and sympathy that crossed his face, and he nodded. "All right. Does your mother know you took that?" "No, sir." He nodded again. "Well, then we'll hope she doesn't spot it gone before we get back. Come on, and don't drop it." Half an hour later, the two of us stood on the bank looking down at the place where the castle stream forked, at the flat place where I'd had my encounter with the man with the red-orange eyes. I had my bamboo rod in my hand. I'd picked it up below the bridge, and my creel lay down below on the flat place. Its wicker top was flipped back. We stood looking down, my father and I, for a long time, and neither of us said anything. "Opal, diamond, sapphire, jade, I smell Gary's lemonade." That had been the unpleasant little poem, and once he'd recited it, he had thrown himself on his back, laughing like a child who had just discovered he has enough courage to say bathroom words like shit or piss. The flat place down there was as green and lush as any place in Maine that the sun can get to in early July, except from where the stranger had laid. There the grass was dead and yellow in the shape of a man. I looked down and saw that I was holding my lumpy old family Bible straight out in front of me with both thumbs pressed so hard on the cover that they were white. It was the way Mama Sweet's husband Norval held a willow fork when he was trying to douse somebody a well. "Stay here," said my father at last, and skidded sideways down the bank, digging his shoes into the rich, soft soil and holding his arms out for balance. I stood where I was, holding the Bible stiffly out at the ends of my arms like a willow fork, my heart thumping wildly. I don't know if I had a sense of being watched that time or not. I was too scared to have a sense of anything, except for a sense of wanting to be far away from that place in those woods. My dad bent down and sniffed at where the grass was dead and grimaced. I knew what he was smelling. Something like burnt matches. And then he grabbed my creel and came up back on the bank, hurrying. He snagged one fast look over his shoulder to make sure nothing was coming along behind. Nothing was. When he handed me the creel, the lid was still hanging back on its cunning little leather hinges. I looked inside and saw nothing but 2 handfuls of grass. "I thought you said you caught a rainbow," my father said. "But maybe you dreamed that too?" Something in my voice stung. "No, sir," he said. I caught one." "Well, It sure as hell didn't flap out, not if it was gutted and cleaned. You wouldn't put a catch into your fisher box without doing that, would you, Gary? I taught you better than that. Yes, sir, you did, but... So if you didn't dream catching it, and if it was dead in the box, something must have come along and eaten it, said my father. And then he grabbed another quick glance over his shoulder, eyes wide, as if he had heard something move in the woods. I wasn't exactly as surprised to see drops of sweat standing on his forehead like big, clear jewels. Come on, he said. Let's get the hell out of here. I was for that, and we went back along the bank to the bridge, walking quickly without speaking. When we got there, my dad dropped to one knee, examined the place where we'd found my rod. There was another patch of dead grass there, and the lady slippers had all browned and curled in on itself, as if a blast of heat had charred it. While my father did this, I looked in my empty creel. He must have gone back and eaten my other fish. My father looked up at me. Other fish? Yes, sir. I didn't tell you, but I caught a brookie, too. A big one. He was awful hungry, that fella. I wanted to say more, but the words trembled just behind my lips, and in the end I didn't. We climbed up the bridge and helped one another over the railing. My father took my creel, looked into it, and then went to the railing and threw it over. I came up behind him in time to see it splash down and float away like a little boat riding lower and lower in the stream as the water poured in between the wicker weavings. It smelled bad, my father said, but he didn't look at me when he said it, and his voice sounded oddly defensive. It was the only time I'd ever heard him speak that way. Yes, sir. We'll tell your mother that we couldn't find it, if she asks. And if she doesn't ask, we won't tell her anything. No, sir, we won't. And she didn't, and we didn't, and that's the way it was. That day in the woods is 81 years gone, and for many years in between I have never even thought of it. Well, not awake, at least. Like other man or woman who ever lived, I can't say about my dreams, not for sure. But now I'm old, and I dream awake, it seems. My infirmities have crept up like waves which will soon take a child's abandoned sandcastle, and my memories have also crept up, making me think of some old rhyme that went in part, just leave them alone and they'll come home, wagging their tails behind them. I remember meals I ate, games I played, girls I kissed in the school cloakroom when we played post office, boys I chummed with, the first drink I ever took, the first cigarette I ever smoked, corn shuck behind Dickie Hammer's pig shed, and I threw up. Yet all of the memories, the one of the man in the black suit is the strongest and glows with its own spectral, haunting light. He was real. He was the devil, and that day I was either his errand or his luck. I feel more and more strongly that I escaped him by my luck, just luck, and not the intercession of God I have worshipped and sung hymns to all my life. As I lie here in my nursing room, in the ruined sandcastle that is my body, I tell myself that I need not fear the devil, that I have lived a good, kindly life, and that I need not fear the devil. Sometimes I remind myself that it was I, not my father, who finally coaxed my mother back to church later on that summer. In the dark, however, these thoughts have no power to ease or comfort. In the dark comes a voice which whispers that the 9-year-old boy I was had done nothing for which he might legitimately fear the devil either. And yet, the devil still came. And in the dark, sometimes I hear that voice drop even lower into the ranges which are inhuman. Big fish, it whispers in tones of hushed greed, and all the truths of the moral world fall to ruin before its hunger. Big fish. The devil came to me once, long ago. Suppose he were to come again now. I'm too old to run away. I can't even get to the bathroom and back without my walker. I have no fine brook trout with which to appropriate him either, even for a moment or two. I am old and my creel is empty. Suppose he were to come back and find me. And suppose he's still hungry.